and welcome to another edition of C-Vision International podcast series on third-party risk. And today we're happy to welcome Brian Haugli. Is a former CISO of a Fortune 500 insurance carrier and a practitioner in the intelligence and defense community here in the U.S. Brian, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great.
Perfect. Well, let's talk about third-party risk. It's been a topic on the news lately. Obviously, SolarWinds brought a lot of this to the forefront. Of course, we in the security community have always known about it. It's not a new topic for us by any means, but it's certainly bringing it
hmm
up the airways, and that's great. We need the attention on this topic, and of course, you've been working in this space for a long time yourself, and you've got some initiatives going on right now that we'd love to dig into with you. So, what is third-party risk, and why should anybody care?
Yeah, so it's really just anybody who's outside of your organization. Are you depending on them in some way, right? I founded SideChannel as a means to bring security leadership into the middle market and really address kind of an underserved space for most organizations, right? Most organizations don't sit inside of the Fortune 1000. So these groups, these companies are the ones who are getting assessed and are also the ones who need to really step up their, a look at their own supply chain. So, I'm an organization, you're my vendor, right? How do I know that you are, taking care of your security at the level at which I expect? Maybe you have access to my infrastructure. Maybe you're providing some type of services to me. Maybe I'm sharing data with you for you to process, analyze, and then provide back some type of analysis so I can go on about with my business. Well, if I'm relying on you as a vendor, how do I know that you're protecting now me extending my boundary out to you, right? If I've given you data, how do I know that you're protecting it appropriately at the standard at which I'm trying to protect the data myself? So third-party, vendor risk management, supply chain risk management, what all these terms really just are, how am I as an organization able to assess those that I depend on to function as a business and appropriately assess them? I think there's been a big push, even before SolarWinds, to just assess everybody at the same level, as if the folks who are touching your intellectual property should be held to the same standard as the company that's selling you styrofoam cups that you use in your cafeteria. It just doesn't make sense. And there's some providers out there that would make you believe, and some, methodologies that make you believe that you need to assess everyone equally and you can apply this, vanilla approach to everyone. Taking the, a risk management approach where you make decisions about, again, should I assess the styrofoam cup supplier the same as someone who has intellectual property access? Risk management, in taking that approach would say, no, you assess them differently. And if you do so, then you can make different decisions based on that. You can allow a little bit more leeway or even a lot of leeway on the cup supplier, because they're not touching any of your intellectual property. They don't have access to your infrastructure. So if their security is terrible, it's probably a better bet and that they're a better risk to you to assume than, say, the organization that has infrastructure access, right? You want to scrutinize those people differently. So a lot of this comes down to just the procedures that you're building into and the methodology that you adopt on, how do I assess these folks? What is my risk tolerance? What is the level of pain at which I'm willing to accept with any one of these organizations? And then how do I go about assessing them appropriately? And then when do I make the call as to saying, look, this might not be the best business decision for us to use you because, you're not tall enough to get on the ride, right? Like that's basically what it comes down to. So, everyone's just trying to just do it. And I think checkbox that they're doing it. And I think that's what's led to this rude awakening with SolarWinds, which was, oh, well, we thought we were doing, risk assessments, or we were assessing all our vendors, or God forbid, our vendors had the best security in place because that's what they told us. And we just believed them. We didn't actually check. Now it's kind of coming to fruition. It's like, okay, we need to do more. We need to actually dig in, but we can't afford to dig in on everyone. And some people, some we just shouldn't even bother digging in. So how do you set up that discussion and that internal structure to assess appropriately? I think that's where we are right now. And that's what, for any of this to actually work, needs to happen on a go forward basis.
That's perfect. Well, that's a great explanation. I think a lot of the folks So we're coming to this understanding that third-party risk applies to them on both sides of the equation, right? They find themselves either as the vendor or as the consumer of vendor resources and talent and products, especially products, in the key of SolarWind.
Mm.
And how do they do it, right? How do you suddenly figure out, well, what's the framework that we use? How do we communicate risk between ourselves, between the parties? And what's the common model, if there is one? And what's the emerging models that you see out there that both the suppliers and the regulators might be interested in, that are coming to the forefront right now? And how do the organizations position themselves to be better at being assessed and also assessing their suppliers and vendors?
Yeah, there's this, we view it as incoming and outgoing, right? So what's coming into me, how am I being assessed by my clients, by regulators, by other entities that are relying on me? Okay, that's one aspect. That's basically, how do we answer the mail? And that's a lot of lift. That is satisfied by knowing your own security posture. Can you articulate that security posture? And not to just plug SideChannel, but we focus a lot on that as providing fractional CISOs into this market, because that's essentially what the CISO's role is. Be it fractional or full-time at a large organization, your job is to craft and articulate the security narrative for your organization. And you need somebody to be able to do that. And you need somebody who can do that, who actually understands security, who understands risk, and can have a really good conversation with that outside party who's asking you, and be able to articulate your own posture and not really kind of give up too much. So internally, you need to be able to have great communication with the business, right? How important is this person who's assessing us to the business? Is this a huge account? Is this a small account? Do we have leverage? Do they have leverage? And then understanding with your legal team, what should not be saying? Where are we on our roadmap that we are allowed to talk about? So once you kind of have that good understanding internally, then it's getting on either the phone with, or a call, something with that entity that's assessing you, and going through what your current posture is. I feel like there's a lot of this, hey, we're sending you this Excel spreadsheet, fill it out, and then when you don't answer yes to everything, we're going to ask you and scrutinize you as to why. Mm-hmm. That doesn't work, right? Because one, that's a very compliance-based approach, and it's obvious that you're just trying to check the box. So both parties are going to do the least, available to satisfy that. It's very, very obvious. There becomes a really great discussion, or it becomes valuable, I think, to both parties, when you can ask, hey, who's your security leader? Can we have a conversation? This is obviously so important to you that you're assessing us, that this probably merits a discussion. Give me your CISO's phone number. I'm willing to talk to you about this. Let's talk about it. I don't want just this to be some engineer to engineer battle of GRC former auditors, right? Because that's usually what's happening. We're seeing it happen a lot, and it doesn't bear any fruit. So look, I'm the security practitioner and leader for this organization. You obviously have one if you're big enough to be structuring a program to be assessing me. Let's talk about it. What are your real concerns? What are your real fears about having me as a supplier to you? And that wins a ton of kudos kind of all around. It removes a lot of friction out of sales cycles. We have a great example, with a client where they were trying to position and finish a deal, and the entity had, as part of the deal, this risk assessment that looked very, very onerous. But it was common. It was a common risk assessment that was provided. And, I happened to, and after winning this client and starting to work with them, it's like, oh, I actually know the CISO at the company that you're trying to do business with. Let me just call him and let me find out what's really going on here. Like, what are they really after? Because this seems like a very template, type of an approach. And there seems to be some friction here. So let me see if I can smooth it. Get him on the phone. First he's like, oh, I didn't realize you guys were supporting the client. That makes me feel better. That's great. When we really kind of talk through a couple things, it's like, you know what? You don't need this 300 question assessment. We really just kind of need to know these 10 things. Can you get that? It's like, oh yeah, we've got that. And the things that we're not doing, they're on the roadmap, and we're here now because we're going to build this program or mature this program for this client. Smooth it out. Deal one, things move forward. Like, that's how it's supposed to happen. Security is supposed to be enabling the business. It's not supposed to be this blocker. And look, no one's perfect. Anybody who's answering yes, that they're doing all of these things on these questionnaires, they're lying to you. Okay. And that should be a red flag. We actually had that in DoD. I won't name which branch, but it rhymes with Air Force. Had this great track record of always just kind of coming back and being like, oh yeah, we're all green on all these things that we were. And this isn't all of headquarters, but like this one entity that we worked with that was a headquarters unit used to just always come back, and it was like, we're green on everything. We'd look at it racked and stacked against everybody else that we had responsibility for. It was like, no, you don't. like you're the red flag on all this stuff because you're all green. There's no way you're perfect. So a lot of it is just, hey, look, this is again where we are. If you're taking a risk management approach, this is what we're not doing. Is what we're not doing that much of a blocker for you? And if it is, okay, that's where we'll prioritize to make sure that you're comfortable and that, you know, we're not upsetting the sales and the revenue stream for this business. But if it's not really that much of a blocker, you know, what are you comfortable with? Can we come back to this in 6 months? Is the roadmap and the plan that we've established to address this risk within the next 3 to 4 months feel appropriate to you? Are you willing to accept that as a risk? And that's just a conversation. And you know what's funny is all CISOs know that they're doing that inside their own organization anyway, with their businesses and things like that. You are accepting risk anyway within your own business. Apply that same type, and no one wants to, you know, rule by exception, but you are already having that type of a conversation. Allow that conversation to happen with those types of vendors that, you know, want to come to the table. So I think there's a lot of really great things to come on the incoming. For outgoing, it's the same thing. You got to play the same principles. What I've found, you know, value on is not this, again, like I said, not assessing everybody at the same level. It's establishing a methodology. I'm a big fan of creating, you know, a 9-block approach. And, you know, where you basically have, you know, your one axis of what's the value of this vendor to you as a business. And then along your other axis, what is the level of access at which this company or vendor has to your fill in the blank infrastructure, data, intellectual property, crown jewels, your brand, your VIPs, whatever it is. What is that level of access? And you can create these axes however you want, but I found that these two variables seem to be the ones that business leaders can usually hone in on, because that's who I'm going to and talking about. Really, it's not just an IT discussion. I'm going to the business line that says, hey, I want to use this vendor. Okay. Without knowing the requirements we're going to apply in each of these 9 blocks, if I gave you these 2 criteria, where would they fall? Okay. And by actually taking that separated view, you remove a lot of the bias, because what I've seen in procurement teams or procurement teams working with businesses is once they know what the requirements are, they'll say, oh, well, they're just below that, so we don't have to assess them as much. And that bias really messes up how to properly assess vendors, because now you're giving a lot of people a lot of leeway, because obviously those down in the lower left are being assessed less. So by removing and having the vendor kind of plotting into this 9-block or whatever it is, independent of knowing what the assessment, you know, criteria are, you get a much better understanding of where your vendors lie. And you'll be surprised, 70% of your vendors are sitting in that outside curve, those outside 2, 3, 5 blocks, right? My math is terrible. Those 2, 3, 5, like that make up that L. You don't have a lot of vendors in that upper right hand box. You have a little bit more in that 3-box L, but you have a majority of them sitting in that outside one. So once you do that, now you can really look at your vendors and go, okay, if I'm going to spend any money on technology and real services to really assess vendors, I'm going to spend it on the probably 5 to 10% that are sitting in the upper right-hand quadrant. Now you have a cost-effective risk management program that you can apply to all of your vendors, and you're not assessing the guys who are selling you styrofoam cups in a cafeteria or for your cafeteria the same way, right? You're not applying that $1,000 per license, $1,500 per license from name your, risk ranking, dashboard program that's out there right now that does it for everybody, and it's like a per license beat. It's like that's not, mid-market companies can't afford that, right? You're applying to where it matters the most, and that's how it should be. That's risk management. So anyway, that's been our approach, and I don't want to say it's one that I've seen work. It's one I've seen a lot of CISOs adopt. So that's how we've made usually our recommendations to clients. Hey, this is how we need to structure this, or this is how you need to structure it and run it. And it's been quite effective. Again, it's about still addressing the risk while being cost effective. And that's kind of the name of the game right now for the middle market.
That's perfect. Well, that's really good. It sounds like you're doing basically threat modeling, right? And you're making it accessible to the mid-market clientele, because that, I mean, one of the big things that we see, and I've spent most of my career in the Fortune 500 space, and I think we both come from that space. And when you try to take things down to the level of a mid-market player, it's hard. You know, the resources are not there, and maybe the talent and the personnel are not there to really put the cycles on this. And when you start talking about these kind of high level concepts of, you know, we got to have a threat modeling program, we have to have a vendor risk assessment program, we have to do a bunch of questionnaires. I mean, just that alone, you mentioned friction, right? That's a problem. When you talk about business impact, you talk to business leaders, you know, we're trying to communicate to them and about the things that matter to them. Well, guess what? Cash flow velocity is definitely a metric that they care about. And when deals get slowed down because you can't either fulfill your obligations under these risk assessment frameworks, or you can't bring vendors in to provide to you what you need to drive your business forward, that really becomes a drag on the business. And then, you know, we're no longer talking about controls at that point. We're talking about really slowing down our operations and impacting our revenue. And that's the problematic thing. And so how do we streamline that process so that, as you said, you know, the security becomes the enabler of the business and not sort of an impediment to driving it forward? You know, being agile, being quick, being responsive, being dynamic, those are all the attributes that businesses care about. So how does security fit in, right? And I think another thing you mentioned is you have to extend your relationships beyond your borders, right? You have to understand that the risk, the third-party risk, is really your risk, right? It might not be your name on the box that you're buying, right? But eventually, as it becomes a part of your own value chain, you know, the supply chain embeds itself into your business. And now what you're selling is, it contains those kinds of things. That's exactly what we saw with SolarWinds, obviously, and many other third-party incidents. So this is not a new idea, but the way you're taking the approach to making it accessible to the mid-market players, which, you know, frankly, most of the businesses, definitely in the United States, are mid-market and below, right? So we've got 14 million businesses in this country, and, you know, Fortune 500 is just 500. So that's
exactly.
when we think about how the risk is spread around and where it sits, you know, there's this kind of a shadow pool of risk that permeates all of these environments. And basically, we have very little visibility to them. And what you're doing is making it possible to instrument them for risk, and then extend their ability to see risk within their own space beyond their borders, which is great. So let's talk a little more about some of the frameworks and your approach to really driving those relationships. How do you make that conversation happen within the business and also outside the business? How do you bring the folks in? How do you make it possible for them to engage in this you know, on this channel of risk, and make that kind of this common uniform frequency for them to talk on?
So I think a lot comes down to two of my favorite sayings. One is, you know, from a security perspective, I am there to enable the business and minimize asset loss. It's not remove asset loss. Like, we are not, you know, in a totality state, just removing all risk. That's not happening. It's to minimize it to a level at which is acceptable. And that's a standard business practice, risk versus reward, right? We're willing to take a risk to get what the reward is. We can apply the same thing to cyber, right? The other one is, I can't defend what I don't know exists. And this basic fundamental aspect of creating an inventory of what you have. And that is not just, and I know a lot of us talk about, what do we have as far as, you know, servers and systems and users, but it does extend to the supply chain. Do you even know who your suppliers are, right? I mean, do you even know how you are able to acquire suppliers? Right? I've seen organizations who have ripped their hair out because they are realizing that there are business folks or functional leaders who, with their credit card, are procuring new vendors outside of the regular procurement channels and offices. And people are losing their minds on that. It's like, well, I love SaaS solutions. I love the ability to buy everything with a credit card and stand that up. But it destroys the ability of both procurement and legal and security to try to control those risks. So, you know, you need to really rein that in. And it's not like, hey, don't do it anymore. It's, hey, you can do it, but here's the process by which you should be allowed to go do it, and let us know. So creating that inventory, like, who has that, like, why is there all this Wild West going on with buying and using and everything? And it's interesting, you know, the CASB solutions that are out there, I swear, are built, and I like them, but I swear a lot of their marketing is built around, like, trying to find that. It's like, well, the horse is out of the barn. Like, and CASBs now are just focusing in on like finding all the horses, making sure you always know where the horses are. It's like, no, no, no. The solution should be figuring out how to keep everybody in the barn appropriately first, and only find them when they leak or get out as a one-off, not as the standard. So I have a lot of fun with those types of discussions and really understanding kind of where the focuses are. But to your, I mean, to I think to the root of your question, the standards exist. It's a matter of what people already know about and are willing to adopt. So in Europe, it seems to be very, very clear. Like everyone is just aligning to an ISO standard. In the US, that's not as clear because there is not this national standard that people know about. You've got different regulations that require each of their own standards. So there's creates this mishmash and like, okay, I don't even know what to start with kind of an approach. So for clients like that, if they're not heavily regulated and held to a prescribed standard, and there are plenty of organizations out there that meet this. I'm a big fan of using our US tax dollars at work, which is, NIST has come out with a number of different standards that they make available. Anyone who's ever followed anything about me online or listened to me talk, I'm a huge NIST cybersecurity framework fanboy. Like I love it. I'm lucky right now to be a contributing author with Cynthia Brumfield on a book on NIST that will come out from Wiley and their academic book division, which will be published later this year, early 2022. We look to be one of the first, if not the first, books that really outline what is the NIST CSF, what does it mean, how can it be used, because these books just don't exist. NIST has done a great job in what they're charged to do, which is build these types of standards and frameworks. But it's up to practitioners like yourself and myself to evangelize the usage, show how it works inside of organizations. When I stepped out of Pentagon in 2015, I remember my talk is still available online. I gave one of the first talks on NIST CSF because it had literally just been signed into law underneath the executive order from Obama, and then really started being kind of presented. And I swear it was really interesting because people in the audience were just like 500 CISOs in this room in Boston were looking at me like, yeah, I think I've heard of that. And now like everyone's, fast forward to 2021 and like everyone's talking about how, this framework or that framework, but there's still this great focus on NIST. So there's an adoption at the higher levels, right? And you're seeing regulators adopting it. New York State basically adopted NIST CSF when they built out the Department of Financial Services Part 500 DFS, regulation. The model law that was built off of that, and the NAIC, who basically took it across all 50 states for adoption. The SEC has adopted it for their waves of examination is based on the NIST CSF. And you're seeing it become the standard that it is, but it's still not like the national standard. I think the federal government could do well to adopt a single standard and basically just say, look, this is it. This is what we in the United States should be aligning to. Stop everyone kind of creating their own. Because look, I saw this with the insurance commissioners across the 50 states. They each have their own way and want of doing something. Mm-hmm. Do you know what that does to companies when you have to align to 50 different methods? It's ridiculous. Why are we allowing? It's literally creating headache. It's creating problems, and it's creating a lot of cost. And I don't think there's really a lot of value by doing it that way. So, this is, I think, where federal regulation and the federal government can really step in and do the right thing and apply some leadership in establishing these type of things. I think what the DoD is doing with the CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model, and what's coming out with that is a step in that direction. And that's great that that's being seen by other federal agencies as a way to apply a standard in which, not only they, but also their supply chains can align to. But I don't, it's still not enough. Like you need really everyone to go, okay, that's it. That's what we're going to align to. And that's our standard. Or NIST is it. Or NIST 800-171 is it. Or just somebody needs to step up inside of that top level leadership of the federal government and say, look, this is what we're doing. This is what we should adopt. Like I think we have enough industry best practices. We have enough industry leaders, and we've had enough time since 2015 to kind of all rally behind one or two of these to now put our stake in the ground and say, look, this is what we're going to do. I think a lot of problems with standards is you get, again, like these former auditors, GRC wonks, and I'm sometimes guilty of this, having too much fun debating the merits of this standard over that standard. And there's no value gained out of that. Honestly, if you looked at a crosswalking of ISO versus the CSF, neither one is missing really what the other one does. They're saying the same thing. They're just saying it differently. And even, again, CMMC versus NIST CSF versus, 80171 is the same basically as CMMC plus 20 extra controls. HIPAA security rule, when you look at the controls inside of that, just for healthcare versus, high trust versus some of these other standards, they're all saying the same thing, but we have all of them. And it's driving a lot of people kind of just to, force create some solutions that I think will play out in the market, and some that I think are just terrible vaporware. Because, folks, again, middle market company sitting there going, I am held to these two regulations, but I need a good security practice. And oh my God, privacy is on the horizon for me as well. Mm-hmm. What do I start with? What do I do first? What do I see all the way through before I go on to the next framework? Mm-hmm. Or how, God forbid, do I meet all of them so that I can just keep my revenue lines in line? I mean, look at what happens with SOC 2 audits, right? And the former SAS 16s, right? Like this type of an approach, right? The AICPA and their approach to things. It's like, why do we have all these different standards? It's because everyone's competing for who it is. And I think we have the opportunity as a nation to be able to set a standard and give some direction. And again, I'm a fan of the CSF. I've also come to really like the CMMC. Mm-hmm. I don't care. I don't care if we adopt ISO as the standard. It doesn't matter. I just think everyone will be better off if we can get down to like one and we can say, look, this is the way that we need to do it. Because again, a lot of really smart security people have all weighed in and said, this is good. Mm-hmm. This one is also good. And that one is also good as well. Mm-hmm. Now it's time to pick one and go with it.
Right. Yeah, you see that exposure, to different standards, definitely at multinationals, and that's where most of my experience comes from, of course. And so that's not uncommon. You operate across borders, and you're definitely going to be subject to different regulations. When GDPR came out, and we saw that on the horizon, and we said, hey, that's coming down. It's going to be an impact even for the U.S. based firms, because we do work with foreign entities and foreign identities. And so that's going to come into the mix. And folks said, well, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if we'll actually be subject to that. And sure enough, here we are, just a couple of years later, and that is true. But right. What's not very well understood, and that's exactly what you're focusing on, is all these mid-market companies that ordinarily you wouldn't believe would be exposed to this myriad of different compliance standards, but yet they are, just by virtue of existing and doing business in their particular industry. And, and as you mentioned, different frameworks, different industries, different verticals, they have their own approach or they have their own take on things. But exactly, when you do a crosswalk, if you do a mapping of all the standards that are there in the cyberspace and the risk space, it's all there. I mean, everything from PCI on through HIPAA, the controls are the controls, right? It's, there's this, idea of comply once, report many, right? And if you build a good, solid cybersecurity model, maybe you're compliant, and then we've kind of talked about, to a number of clients in the past that, compliance is sort of the bare minimum. You meet that bare minimum. Maybe you think that you're secure, but you're not. You're just compliant. There's a difference between compliant and secure. And, the former is based on a set of, particular standards and maybe just a minimum threshold. The other one is about being strategically risk aligned to your business, right? And providing a level of assurance to a business. And these are different objectives. One can be a component of the other. But they're not synonymous, and I think a lot of folks don't get that. But I agree with you. I think there's no more excuse left to throw out this idea of not having a federal standard either on privacy or security, for that matter, or risk management, and having everybody aligned to the same one. It would definitely be helpful, and certainly for smaller businesses that don't have the resources to have an actual standalone compliance function, which larger companies have to. Maybe that would help. And certainly in this space where it's emerging so quickly, and things are moving at such a great pace. Threats are emerging all the time. It's hard to chase compliance. You kind of want to be put on a pace of continuous compliance, right? But how do you do that if the regulations are changing all the time, and then you have so many to comply with? You just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So I think that's one of the challenges that's going to continue to affect everybody, but certainly a lot of the mid-market companies as well. Any closing comments from you?
Yeah, I've harped on the same thing about compliance is not security, right? And chances are you're not even compliant. What I will say, and I'm glad to have seen, is I think how certain regulatory standards and certain compliance aspects have raised the bar of security. So I think 5-10 years ago, compliance to security standards was not as robust as I think what it is now. I mean, if you operate inside of New York State and you are a financial institution or an insurance institution, the standards actually within DFS are pretty good. I mean, I applaud, how they built that out and took the lead to be the first state to really move the needle. I mean, if you built a New York State, security aligned program, you actually have a really good security posture. Now, the compliances aspects of it, kind of say like, are you doing this? So, you can check yes or are you not. There's no level of maturity to it. There is, they do require you to do risk assessments. They do require you to have a CISO. You're allowed to have an outsourced CISO, right? So this helps that mid-market space, still meet the intent. Is there work to do? Yes. But I think what we're going to see is these compliance standards, these regulatory components kicking in are going to up what we have seen with security. There's still more to do, obviously, on top of that, but I think we are going to see the bar really being raised with the new initiatives that are coming out. But we're still going to your point, and what we were just talking about, we're still going to have the issue of, well, I'm held to this one over here and that one over there, and then this one, and then this is what, how am I managing to all of them? So that's still something that people, in the mid-market are very much going to navigate. And just keep in mind, the folks who are upstream from you, if you're a mid-market company, your customers, they're held to regulatory standards as well. They are probably just turning because they know what they need to meet. They're probably just turning and asking you, are you meeting what they have to meet, right? They're not trying to invent their own. They're probably just trying to parrot what's being given to them to make sure that you align so that they can say they align. So just keep that in mind as you are, as companies are trying to figure out well, why am I being asked, at this level versus that company over there is asking that? It's probably because of the standard that they're being held to. So, I thank you so much for your time today on discussing this. I love this topic. Obviously, security is all I've done for my entire life. I don't know why, but the only thing I was good at. I'm passionate about it. I love it. Definitely follow me around on LinkedIn. Anytime you see hashtag CISO Life, you'll find me. And would love to continue the conversation with C-Vision. And hopefully move the needle for a lot of these organizations.
Brian, thanks again. It was great hearing your opinions, and thanks for sharing the work that you're doing at the mid-market sector. It's no surprise that large companies have complex compliance obligations. What might be more surprising is that smaller companies are still subject to the same regulations and sometimes have even more stringent compliance obligations, yet they don't have those kinds of resources. So the work that you're doing with SideChannel Security, addressing those needs, providing the virtual CISO services to those companies to be able to prioritize their resources, to be able to understand what their risk needs are and how to improve their security posture overall, I think that's important work. It's work that's sorely needed. And of course, out of the 14 million businesses that we have in the United States, only 100 belong on the Fortune 100 list. So it's important that we address the risk posture of the entire national landscape writ large, and you're helping make that possible. So thanks again for the work that you do. Thank you for coming on and sharing your opinions. And we'd love to have you on again. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for another episode of C-Vision International CISO Thought Leadership Podcast. We'll see you again soon.